I am very grateful that so many of you have come at some sacrifice from some distance in some cases and at some cost. I'm very grateful for the scholars who've come from far away to join us, and I'm grateful that Professor Robert George would take time out of his schedule. Professor George has been a friend of the Wheatley Institution and a friend of BYU now for many years. One measure of, I think, the success of whether or not we're living the kind of life we need to live is to look at those with whom we are yoked in the work. And we are honored, and I feel it a special personal privilege to be yoked with Professor Robert George. He has come at no small sacrifice, and I feel to express for you as well our gratitude that he would do that. Professor George holds the Princeton celebrated McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence and is the founding director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton. He is chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He has served on the President's Council on Bioethics and as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, among other things. He's a former judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States. He has published a number of books. I will read some of those titles: In Defense of Natural Law, Making Men Moral, The Clash of Orthodoxies, Law, Religion, and Morality in Crisis, Conscience and Its Enemies, and most recently, and more recently, and perhaps particularly appropriate for this evening, is What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense, and a follow-up book, Conjugal Union, What Marriage Is and Why It Matters. He is published in such journals as Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, the Columbia Law Review, and the American Journal of Jurisprudence, to name just a few. He's won a number of national and international awards, which I won't take time to read because I'd rather hear him. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, and he also received a master's degree in theology from Harvard and a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University. A good friend, a bright person, a Christian gentleman, and we're happy to have him with us, Professor Robert George.
I want to begin by congratulating Richard and Emily on the wonderful work that they do through the Wheatley Institution. And while I'm at it, let me thank the people who helped to make that possible. First and, of course, above all, the Wheatley family. Also the overseers and the members of the Leadership Council. The Wheatley Institution is one of the good things happening in the academic world, not just here at BYU, in the academic world as a whole these days. And so it's wonderful that people like Richard and Emily and Mr. and Mrs. Wheatley and their family, the overseers and the Leadership Council, are making it possible. And I want to say what a pleasure it is to be back at BYU. Last spring, I became an honorary alumnus of this university, which I feel was a sort of ratification of a bond that had been created over many years. And I take enormous pride in my relationship with BYU. Great to be here with so many old friends and to make new friends, especially Bruce Hafen, whose work and witness I've admired for a long time. And of course, my dear old friends, Lynn Wardle is here, Jay Budziszewski. Jay is not only a good friend, you'll be hearing from him tomorrow, not only a good friend, but someone from whose writings I have learned a good deal, especially on the sorts of issues that this conference is concerned with. So I want to thank Jay for his work and witness and the courage that he has shown in the academic world to do the kind of work that he does, to defend the positions that he does, which, as you all know, is not easy. I want to explore what the logical and psychological consequences are of redefining marriage. Let me begin this way. The Youngs, no relation to Brigham Young, I assure you, different Youngs. The Youngs are women in a committed relationship who love and care for and look after each other. They share domestic duties and financial responsibilities. They share a bed and a sexual partnership. They have a child, courtesy of sperm donation and in vitro fertilization. And they intend to have 2 more. They were united in a ceremony in which they wore beautiful white wedding gowns, I've seen the pictures, and were walked down the aisle by their fathers. They are just like any ordinary Massachusetts opposite-sex or same-sex married couple, only they're not a couple. Doll, Kitten, and Bryn Young are a throuple, a 3-person unit. And Massachusetts, like other states, does not recognize as marriages polyamorous unions, that is, unions among 3 or more persons, romantic partnerships with multiple partners. At least Massachusetts and other states don't recognize those unions yet. And Doll and Kitten and Bryn think that that's unfair and should change. They want marriage equality for themselves and other polyamorous families. They are proud that their home state of Massachusetts was in the vanguard of legally recognizing same-sex partnerships as marriages, thanks to the intervention of the liberal-dominated Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. But they insist that the same principles that generated what they, and most liberals, and it seems more than a few conservatives these days, believe to be marriage equality for gays, should produce the same result for other sexual minorities, especially polyamorous people like themselves. After all, if gender doesn't matter for marriage, they ask, why should number matter? If love makes a family, as the very successful slogan has it, then why should their family be treated by society and under the law as second class, indeed second rate, as not a real marriage? Why should their marriage be denied legal recognition and the dignity and social standing that come with it? Doll, Kitten, and Bryn love each other and are as committed to each other and their child and their future children as, say, Donald Trump and his 3rd wife, or Elton John and his husband. You know how that argument goes. They find fulfillment in their long-term sexual partnership, just as opposite-sex and same-sex couples find fulfillment in theirs. The dignity of their relationship, not to mention their own personal dignity, is assaulted, they believe, when their marriage is treated as inferior and unworthy of legal recognition. And to what end, Bryn and Kitten and Doll ask, is their child and their future children stigmatized? How does it harm the marriage of, say, John and Harold, the couple next door, if the Commonwealth of Massachusetts recognizes the Young's marriage. Indeed, what justification can be given? What legitimate state interest can be cited for dishonoring Doll, Kitten, and Bryn and their marriage? Surely, they say, the only explanation, apart from religious scruples of some sort, the sort that may not constitutionally be imposed by the state, is animus, a bare desire to harm people who are different. Some of you will recognize the concept of animus and the bare desire to harm people from the opinions of Justice Anthony Kennedy of the Supreme Court of the United States in this area. And you'll notice that the arguments, to the extent of their success, are as successful when invoked by Bryn, Kitten, and Doll as when invoked by, say, John and Harold, or Sally and Jill. Over the past couple of years, a number of mainstream websites, newspapers, and magazines, Salon, Slate, USA Today, Newsweek, The Atlantic Monthly, People magazine, have all run sympathetic stories about polyamory. Newsweek reports that though polyamory remains unconventional, it is far from unheard of. There are, Newsweek says, approximately 500,000 polyamorous households in the United States today. Polygamous and polyamorous relationships, often with children in the picture, are depicted as just one more historically misunderstood and often victimized way of being a family. The polyamorous partners profiled in these stories sometimes weave discussion of the ordinary challenges and simple joys of domestic life, dealing with disagreements, getting the kids to do their homework or to practice the piano, celebrating birthdays and other special occasions, together with peekaboo accounts of what it's like for throuples, or larger polyamorous units, quadrads, quintets, to share a bed and have sex. I should point out that there's a difference between polyamory and polygamy. Polygamy, of course, is well known historically, practiced by the prophets, practiced by Mormons in the 19th century. Yes, polygamy is fairly well known historically. Polyamory is not. In polygamy, the most familiar form of which is polygyny, a man is in several different marriages. So Joe is married to Jill in a marriage, and Joe is married to Sally in a marriage, and Joe may be married to Nancy in a marriage. Polyamory is different. In polyamory, Joe and Jill and Sally and Bill and Nancy are all married as one sexual unit. One marriage, one happy family, one big party. They've got to invent something bigger than king size. Now, not long ago, the New York Times published an essay by University of Chicago law professor William Bode, urging readers to keep their minds open toward multiple partner sexual relationships. He noted that they could have some advantages over monogamous partnerships. For example, more parents available to look after the kids and share domestic duties. And he easily identified the weaknesses of the arguments made by writers like Richard Posner, who oppose multi-party marriages, but support redefining marriage to include same-sex partnerships. The kind of people who think they can draw the line at same-sex unions. We should remember, Bode observed, and I'm quoting him, that today's show-stopping objections sometimes come to seem trivial decades later. Very few people supported a constitutional right to same-sex marriage when writers like Andrew Sullivan and Jonathan Rauch were advocating it only 2 decades ago. Judge Posner, for example, did not. He came to support same-sex marriage later. As we witness, Bode goes on, more experiments with non-nuclear families, our views about multiple partner marriages might change as well, unquote. Sorry to be sitting. I hope you can still see and hear me. I'm having a lot of back trouble, and so Richard kindly put a chair up here for me. Now, many polyamorous people say that their desire or felt need for multiple partners is central to their identity, and that they have known from an early age that they could never find personal and sexual fulfillment in a purely monogamous relationship or a purely monogamous way of life. The message is that they are, polyamorists are, the next sexual minority whose human rights, including, of course, the right to marriage equality, must be honored. They are following to a T the playbook that same-sex marriage advocates created, and they're doing it, of course, in the cause of mainstreaming polyamory and putting in place the cultural predicates for its legal recognition. Things like planting sympathetic articles in USA Today, People Magazine, The Atlantic Monthly, Newsweek, etc. Okay, so the most recent polling has it that a quarter of our fellow citizens are now prepared to recognize polyamorous marriages. Now think about that, 25% of the public. Don't think Utah. 25% of the general public are prepared to recognize polyamorous marriages. And get this one. Among religiously unaffiliated citizens, whose numbers are climbing in the United States, the figure is 58%. If a candidate wins a presidential election with 58% of the vote, that is considered an overwhelming landslide. 58% of our religiously unaffiliated citizens say, yes, we should legally recognize as marriages 3-party or 4-party or 5-party unions. These percentages, I want you to note, represent far higher levels of support than same-sex marriage had within the memory of many people in this room, and not just the oldest like me. Now, for years, of course, many advocates of sexual freedom and same-sex marriage counseled against openly advocating polyamory, for obvious reasons. You don't want to frighten the horses. But not everyone listened. University of Arizona, I think she's now Arizona State professor, Elizabeth Brake, for example, who's a prominent advocate in the world of academic philosophy for broadening the historic understanding of marriage, has for many years promoted what she calls minimum marriage, in which, and I quote her, individuals can have legal marital relationships with more than one person, reciprocally or asymmetrically, themselves determining the sex and number of parties, the type of relationship involved, and which rights and responsibilities to exchange with each, unquote. Judith Stacy, if anything, an even more prominent academic, a New York University professor who is in no way regarded as a fringe figure, also let the cat out of the bag in the course of testifying before Congress against the Defense of Marriage Act. Now remember, she was the witness, or among the witnesses, that the pro-same-sex marriage side put up in Congress. That's how respectable she is. somebody they thought would be able to sell ordinary congressmen and senators, representatives and senators. Well, here's what she did. She expressed the hope that redefining marriage would give it, and I quote, varied, creative, and adaptive contours, leading some to question the dyadic limitations of Western marriage. Dyadic means two. And seek small group marriages, unquote. I guess you're sort of conservative if you want them to be small group marriages. Not sure why she wants to keep it small. Indeed, as far back as a decade ago, in a statement then titled Beyond Gay Marriage, more than 300 self-identified LGBT and allied scholars and advocates called for legally recognizing as marriages or the equivalent sexual relationships involving more than two partners. Among the signatories were such influential figures on the left as Gloria Steinem, Barbara Ehrenreich, and Kenji Yoshino. These and other open advocates of polyamory and its legal recognition now look like they were ahead of their time. With USA Today, Newsweek, People, The Atlantic, and other respected publications sympathetically presenting polyamory, more and more polyamorous and allies of their cause will feel safer in coming out. Now, the politicians aren't there yet, of course, but in this late season of our experience, we all know that they are almost always among the last to arrive at the party. Soon enough, a small number will break the ice, though, just as they did on same-sex marriage. They will initially be members of the Massachusetts and Vermont delegations, I predict. They will, to use President Obama's famous description of his own flip-flop on same-sex marriage, evolve. Now, the late and extraordinarily influential legal philosopher and constitutional theorist Ronald Dworkin, a champion of aggressive judicial action to advance liberal causes, taught that law is fundamentally about a society making commitments to certain moral principles and working out their implications over time. I was one of the students sitting in Professor Dworkin's classrooms, and he could make a very powerful case for this idea of law. And fundamental to that enterprise is treating like cases alike. The heart of the case for same-sex marriage was that gender differences, or what used to be called sex differences, are irrelevant to what marriage actually is, namely a form of committed sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership. The challenge for same-sex marriage supporters is either to accept polyamory on the basis of the very same vision of marriage, sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, or to offer a new and more specific vision, one that can explain why number is relevant, but gender is not. Why marriage has to be two and can't be more than two, although it can be same-sex or opposite sex. Pushed by the logic of the position, very soon, people who are holding the line, wanting to affirm same-sex marriage but not polyamory, will yield. I don't want to step on my friend Richard Williams' terrain as a psychologist, but it seems to me that there is a powerful psychological pressure to follow the logic of one's beliefs when other people are pointing out inconsistencies. Even as an increasing number of so-called marriage equality supporters agree that the time for recognition of polyamorous marriages has come, some still try to avoid the question. Only a few have been willing to hold the line as a matter of principle, at least in the academic world. Marriage is, as a matter of principle, a two-person partnership. So unions of three or more persons ought to be denied the legal dignity of recognition, or the dignity of legal recognition. There are really very few people, lots of people want to dodge the question, but very few people actually want now to come out and say what is in fact inconsistent to say, that I believe marriage should be same-sex as well as opposite sex, but it should be limited to two and not expanded to three or more. The trouble for these folks is that they can't come up with anything approaching a plausible argument, having adopted a conception of marriage as essentially sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, so that you can say two persons of the same sex can marry. If that's in fact what marriage is, and all marriage is, sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, yes, two persons of the same sex can marry. They can feel affection for each other, make a commitment to live together and care for each other and take joint responsibility for a domestic household, believe that sexual play together will enhance the quality of their relationship. Sure, on the sexual romantic partnership conception of marriage, two persons of the same sex can do that as well as two persons of opposite sexes, but so can Bryn and Kitten and Doll, or any three or four or five persons. If that's what marriage is, number can't matter any more than gender matters. Now, those who do want to draw that line sometimes try to make something out of the alleged fact that homosexuality is a sexual orientation, as they call it, but polyamory is not. But who said that was a fact? Bryn and Kitten and Doll deny it. And in fact, what is a sexual orientation? And who discovered it? The concept or construct of sexual orientation, as our psychologist friends can tell us, is not ancient. Same-sex relations were well known in the ancient world. In some places, commonly practiced. In some places, even commonly practiced without moral qualm or even encouraged. But the concept or construct of sexual orientation is a modern one, a roughly 19th century one, out of which now a great deal has been made. But if there really is something corresponding to that concept that the ancients didn't know about, someone must have discovered it. Who? And by what methods? Scientific? That's the claim, that science tells us that there is the thing sexual orientation. Well, I'd like to see the experiment. I'd like to see the application of scientific methods that yielded that result. And why does it yield the result for same-sex orientation, but not for polyamorous orientation? And try to explain it not just to me, but to Bryn and Kitten and Doll. Or sometimes folks who want to have it both ways point to practical difficulties in administering principles of family law for partnerships involving more than two. Oh, it all gets very complicated, doesn't it, if we allow three or more? So we should keep marriage at two. Occasionally you'll hear an advocate of same-sex marriage who opposes polyamory say, a person cannot fully give himself or herself to two people as he or she can to one person. And even more rarely, someone will suggest that polyamorous unions are not psychologically or morally appropriate for bringing up children. But once you've conceded the basic idea that marriage is sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, none of those arguments is going to work. They all look like bootstrapping. They all look like just trying to keep the door shut so that something that for now some people still think is icky can't get in. From the perspective of polyamorous people and their allies, all of these arguments are weak to the point of being contemptible. Thin rationalizations for excluding them, the Bryns and Kittens and Dolls of the world, from a recognition and status that others in relevantly similar relationships are given. For poly people, being poly is as central to their identity, and being in polyamorous relationships is as vital to their fulfillment as being gay and being in a same-sex partnership is for persons who are sexually or romantically attracted to persons of the same sex. Polyamorists object to being the sexual minority that gets thrown under the bus, forced to settle for a relationship that fails to fulfill them or respond to who they really are, or be denied the social support and legal recognition that other people's relationships receive. As for those practical problems, polyamorists note that modern law in a wide variety of areas deals with complexities far greater than those that legal recognition of Doll and Kitten and Bryn Young's marriage would pose. Administrative burdens are, they observe, no basis at all for denying them their basic civil right to marry. And they find it insulting when non-poly people claim that being polyamorous is not central to their identity and fulfillment, or assume that people like Doll and Kitten and Bryn cannot give themselves as fully to each other as gay or straight monogamous people do. Based on their personal experience and what they know from the experience of other poly people, they also reject the view that being in a multiple partner union increases the likelihood of marital problems arising from jealousy. To them, this is stereotyping, sheer prejudice, dressed up in scientific or social scientific garb. Finally, they are not buying the idea that polyamory would unavoidably, or in the modern world even frequently, lead to women's subordination. In any event, why should their rights to be who they are and to have their relationship honored and their children protected be held hostage to the fear that other people will conduct their marriages in morally bad or psychologically unhealthy ways? If forms of patriarchy that were common in most societies in the past provide reasons to limit marriage, say to two persons, they equally provide reasons to abolish marriage altogether. So they argue, if you're going to have marriage and recognize marriage for some, it's got to be for all, and poly people can't be left out or thrown under the bus. Now, of course, the case for polyamory and its legal recognition presupposes that marriage is, in fact, what the advocates of what they call marriage equality have depicted it as being. Again, committed sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership. And this is precisely what has been denied by defenders of what used to be known as marriage and is now called traditional marriage. That is the union of husband and wife. Those defenders are most assuredly right when they say that the new idea of marriage, marriage as sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, is not an expansion of marriage, but is rather a redefinition. It's a genuine innovation. It's not just bringing more people aboard. It's one that treats what has historically been regarded as a relevant difference, a centrally relevant difference, namely sex or gender, as if it were irrelevant, not central to the very idea and social purposes of marriage. Now, in law and culture, at least our law and culture, the law and culture of the West, although I think it's very much the same in most nations of the world, including in cultures of the world, including in the East, but in any event, in our law and culture, marriage has historically been understood as a conjugal union. A union in which a man and woman consent to unite in a bond that is, one, founded upon their sexual reproductive complementarity as male and female. Two, consummated and renewed by acts that unite the spouses as a reproductive unit, in biblical terms, one flesh, by fulfilling the behavioral conditions of procreation, whether or not the non-behavioral conditions happen to obtain. That's why historically in our law and culture, religious as well as secular, marriage could only be consummated by an act of coitus. But marriage was consummated by that act whether or not a child was conceived or could have been conceived. Even in the case where, let's say, due to a wife's being past childbearing, a child could not have been conceived. Still, the marriage is consummated precisely by the sort of act that is apt for procreation, the sort of act that fulfills the behavioral conditions of procreation, whether or not the non-behavioral conditions obtain. Behavioral conditions are conditions over which human beings have agency. Non-behavioral conditions are those over which they do not. And three, a bond that is specially apt for and would naturally be fulfilled by the couple, the spouses, having and rearing children together. Those were the three crucial elements of marriage, as historically understood in our law and culture, and which distinguish it from the contemporary rival idea of marriage as sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership. The historic understanding of marriage is child-centered, and yet it does not instrumentalize marriage to the great good of having children. Marriage is rather the kind of union that would naturally be fulfilled by having and rearing children together. A union that can be entered into precisely under that description, even by a man and woman who cannot, let's say again because of the infertility of one or both spouses, have children. Participating in marriage as a conjugal union is regarded as, in our law and culture, inherently humanly fulfilling. And that's why marriage is not, as we've historically understood it, a merely instrumental good, whether it's instrumental to personal fulfillment or instrumental to having children. It's regarded rather as an intrinsic or constitutive aspect of human well-being and fulfillment. An intrinsic and not merely instrumental good. Valuable not merely as a means to something else, even the great good of having and rearing children, but in itself. Although, of course, children are a blessing that come, when properly conceived, in the bond of marriage, and children are participating perfections of their parents' marriages. So marriage is not separated from children. It's still centrally concerned with children and child rearing. But it's not merely instrumentally valuable, even to the great good of having children. It remains intrinsically valuable. Now, the idea of marriage as a conjugal union explains the structuring features of marriage in our moral and legal traditions, including, one, the rules of consummation, including annullability for non-consummation, but not for fertility. Notice that feature of our law of marital consummation. A marriage can be annulled, that is, we're not talking about a divorce here. We're talking about a legal declaration that the marriage was never completed. It can be annulled for non-consummation, but it cannot be annulled for infertility. Let's say a man or a woman, let's say in this case the man, desperately wants to have children. He marries the woman. It turns out the woman would love to have children, but biologically there's some impediment and she cannot have children. They consummate their marriage. He goes to court, whether it's a religious court or a secular court, and seeks a declaration of nullity. The answer the court will give is, nope. The marriage was completed and is a true marriage when it is consummated, not when a child is conceived or born. Now, the result is the opposite in a case where the marriage has not been consummated. Then a marriage, even though the ceremony's been entered into, the license has been signed, sealed, and delivered, and so forth, non-consummation can be a ground for a declaration of nullity. It tells you something very important about what marriage is. It's not mere sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, nor is it merely instrumental to having children. It is rather a one-flesh union, a union made possible by the biological sexual complementarity of man and woman. A complementarity whose natural end, of course, is having children. And actually we can see that if we just do a little thought experiment amongst ourselves here. How many of you have a digestive system? Everybody has a digestive system. Yeah. How many of you have a neural system? Yeah, everybody has a neural system. Now you know something's coming, right? How many of you have a reproductive system? Yeah, people are only raising their hands halfway up. You're right. You've got half a reproductive system. For most purposes of most human activity, the being performing the act is performed by a human being as an individual. Locomotion, speech, digestion. We just had a lovely meal, some of us upstairs. We're all digesting our meal. We're doing that as individuals. But notice that reproduction is different. It's a single act, but it's not performed by the individual, but rather by the man and woman, precisely as a mated pair. Each has half the system needed for reproduction. When they unite as one flesh. For purposes of reproduction, not for all purposes, husbands and wives don't cooperate in the processes of digestion or locomotion, but they do for reproductive purposes, and they do when they perform acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of reproduction, whether or not those acts are procreative in the end. And we can see that too with the little thought experiment. The farmer or the scientist, the anatomist, can tell when the bull and the cow have mated before waiting to see whether a calf is produced, right? The farmer knows when they've done the mating. He doesn't have to wait to see whether there's a calf, whether the mating was successful in the sense of the calf being conceived and born. He knows when the mating takes place. And we also know the following. Sometimes whether an act, whether it's the act initially consummating a marriage or a later marital act, we can know what kind of act the act is and whether the act has taken place despite the fact that whether the act will in the end produce a child may be dependent on something that hasn't even happened yet. Sometimes an act will or won't be procreative, depending on something that happens later than when the act was performed. But the act can't be one kind of act rather than another, depending on something that will happen in the future. It's an act that unites the spouses as one flesh now. And that's fundamentally what marriage is. Now, marriage isn't only the biological aspect of things. Marriage is rather a comprehensive sharing of life. Where the argument for same-sex marriage and polyamory goes wrong is in supposing that marriage is a sharing at the affective level, and at the affective level only. Marriage is a union of hearts and minds. And if that's true, you don't need a man and a woman. You can have two men united in heart and mind, two women. Or three women like Bren and Kitten and Doll. Or a guy and two women, or two women and a guy. Or four or five. They can have tender feelings for one another, want to do things together. Maybe one of the things they like to do together is sex. Maybe it's not. Maybe they like to go bowling instead. It doesn't matter. That's the level at which you can make sense of marriage as a same-sex or multi-partner relationship. But if marriage is what the supporters of conjugal marriage believe it is, if it's what historically our law and culture have always embodied, then marriage is a comprehensive sharing of life, yes, at the affective level, but also at the bodily or biological level, where the biological unity, made possible by sexual complementarity, is the foundation and matrix of the comprehensive sharing of life. That is the sharing of life at every level of human being. The biological, the emotional, the rational, the dispositional, even, as religious people believe, the spiritual. Notice the profound difference between those two conceptions of marriage. And you will come out one way rather than another, depending on which of those conceptions you believe is true. You'll come out in favor of same-sex marriage or multi-partner marriages. If you believe marriage is fundamentally a union of hearts and minds, a union at the emotional or affective level, and a different way if you believe that marriage is a comprehensive sharing of life grounded on the biological aspect of our being as human beings. So, on the conjugal understanding of marriage, persons are conceived as unities of body and mind, and marriage as uniting spouses at all levels of being, the biological as well as the affective and rational and dispositional and spiritual. Acts of bodily union fulfilling the behavioral conditions of procreation are the distinctive completion and seal of this uniquely comprehensive unity, which is why the law always made such a big deal out of consummation. From the point of view of the alternative sexual romantic companionship view of marriage, the idea that the law ever made a big deal out of consummation must be utterly perplexing. People must think that the people in the past were just really weird. Why would they think consummation mattered? But from the conjugal point of view of conjugal marriage, you can see why it centrally mattered. These acts don't just produce feelings of intimacy, feelings at the affective level. They literally embody. They embody the spouses' marital unity by making them one flesh, by making them a biological and not merely emotional, a biological unit, with everything else, the emotional, the rational, dispositional, founded on the biological unity. Sex is thus integral to marriage, which is part of what distinguishes marriage from other forms of companionship. One problem for the sexual romantic companionship view of marriage that will give you same-sex marriage or multi-partner marriage or what have you, One problem with that is it's hard to explain on that understanding of marriage what's distinctive about marriage. Why it isn't just like other forms of friendship, maybe just with a kind of more emotional intensity. Different in degree, but not in kind. But on the conjugal understanding, you can see exactly the difference. It's a difference not merely of intensity of emotions, but a difference of kind. You can distinguish marriage from all sorts of other friendships, no matter how wonderful, intense, close they are. On the conjugal understanding of marriage, marriage cannot be understood simply as your relationship with your number one person. On the alternative view, that's just what marriage is. As John Corvino, a well-known philosopher who was a defender of same-sex marriage, says, when pressed to define what marriage is, he defines it that way. Marriage is simply your relationship with your number one person. As a conjugal relationship, rather, marriage is the type of bond that's ordered to procreation and would naturally be fulfilled by spouses having and rearing children together, the point I made earlier. On the conjugal understanding, marriage is the relationship that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife to be father and mother to any children who may come of their union. Now, what about the social role of marriage? Why should the law be involved? Why should we care about marriage as a legal institution? Well, the social role of marriage, if you accept the conjugal understanding, is to maximize the odds that children will grow up in the context of the committed love, the matrimonial bond, of the man and woman whose actualization and renewal of that bond in sexual intercourse brought them life, linked to their parents and to their parents' families. It ensures that as many children as possible will be reared with the advantages of both maternal and paternal role models, influences, and care. A large part of the project of trying to defend same-sex marriage is to try to show that male and female parents, mothers and fathers, are interchangeable. There's no difference between mothers and fathers, no difference between males and females that cashes out at the level of when people are mothers and fathers. The conjugal view is predicated on the idea, at least when it comes to the social importance of marriage under the conjugal view, it's predicated on the idea that it's a good thing for children to have both maternal and paternal role models, influences, and care. And I've noticed in my own debates with people who are on the other side of this question, very frequently this is silently or implicitly acknowledged, the importance of having role models. A woman who's in a same-sex relationship with another woman and they have a child that's the biological child of one of them, when we were discussing this issue, told me that she thought that it was very important for their child that, and very useful and valuable, that her father, the grandfather of the child, I'm not sure it was the biological grandfather, but it was a male figure, the grandfather was in the life of the child. Well, I agree. But I agree because I think it is important that there be male as well as female role models and examples, giving the kind of care that's characteristic of men and women. And ideally, I think, as much as I love grandfathers and having grandfathers around, and I think grandparents, both grandmothers and grandfathers, play very important roles, and our society has weakened ourselves because grandparents don't play the roles that they used to in people's children's lives. But still, it's better if it's the father and not the grandfather. And I don't see how anybody could really deny that. The revisionist challenge, especially as a result of the sexual revolution and the mainstreaming of non-marital sex and cohabitation, out-of-wedlock childbearing, and divorce, especially with the introduction of no-fault divorce, has eroded the public understanding and support of marriage as a conjugal union, though this vision has not been completely lost. The erosion helps to explain why an idea that was quite literally inconceivable as recently as a generation ago, when my mom and dad were growing up, I mean, no one could consider, it's not that they rejected the idea of same-sex marriage. It was like thinking of square triangles. Just nobody could conceive it. But I think this erosion in other spheres that has nothing to do with homosexuality opposite-sex promiscuity, the divorce culture, the breaking down of traditional norms, the glamorization of out-of-wedlock childbearing has all created a situation in which what was once inconceivable is now defended as morally necessary, even a matter of civil rights. Now, of course, if marriage is distinguished only or mainly by its emotional intensity, then there really is no reason that two men or two women can't marry. Any two people, after all, can feel romantic attraction for each other, commit to support and care for each other in a shared domestic life, and believe that their relationship is enhanced by mutually agreeable sex acts with each other of any kind. But again, so can three men or three women, say Doll and Kitten and Bryn, or a man and a woman, or a man and two women, whether they're united as a polyamorous ensemble or the man is in a separate relationship or marriage with each woman, or a woman and two men, or four people of whatever sexes, or what have you. Now, in the Supreme Court case of Obergefell versus Hodges, 5 justices of the Supreme Court, led by Justice Anthony Kennedy, whose language I quoted earlier, claimed to find in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment the revisionist understanding of marriage. There it was, hiding for all these years since 1868, and no one had noticed, but there it was, a requirement that states not only permit, but legally recognize same-sex partnerships as marriages. Now, let me give you the actual words of the clause so you can decide for yourselves whether those words include a right to same-sex marriage. Here are the words. No state shall deprive any person within its jurisdiction of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's it. That's where they found it. Lurking since 1868, right there. But you know what? Those words don't mean anything of the kind. Let me tell you what they mean. They're all about justice in criminal cases and analogous civil or administrative actions. States may not execute someone, depriving him of life, imprison someone, depriving him of liberty, or subject someone to a monetary fine or forfeiture, depriving him of property, without affording him such basic procedural protections, due process of law, as the presumption of innocence, which isn't anywhere else in the Constitution, it's part of the Due Process Clause, an impartial judge, an impartial jury, and so forth. But the Supreme Court instead followed what has become now a long and notoriously intellectually dubious tradition of reading this procedural guarantee, due process of law, substantively to include unenumerated rights that enough justices, takes 5, believe people should enjoy. Thus, Justice Kennedy, joined by Justices Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, announced the discovery of a right to same-sex marriage that certainly would have shocked the Americans of the late 1860s who ratified the 14th Amendment, and even shocked Americans of the 1960s for all their sexual revolutionary pretensions. For Justice Kennedy, the conjugal understanding of marriage had to be jettisoned in favor of the revisionist sexual romantic companionship conception because the dignity of persons who construct their identities around same-sex attraction and find their fulfillment in same-sex partnerships requires it. This dignity is conferred, Kennedy tells us, by the state and is in effect withheld when the state treats marriage as a conjugal union rather than as sexual romantic companionship. So lacking any warrant in the text or logic or structure or original understanding of the Constitution or even any clear and disciplined engagement with other court cases, right or wrong, Kennedy's opinion merits the condemnation that John Hart Ely, the late dean of the Stanford Law School and himself a pro-choice liberal, heaped on Justice Harry Blackmun's opinion in Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion throughout the United States. Here's what Ely said of Roe. It is not constitutional law and gives no sense of an obligation to try to be, unquote. And he's somebody who was for abortion. Well, that same condemnation applies to Obergefell. The four dissenting justices, Justices Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, Justices Scalia, Thomas, and Alito, had no difficulty skewering, even ridiculing, Justice Kennedy and the majority for failing to identify an even remotely plausible constitutional ground for their decision. Whatever one's beliefs about the comparative merits of the conjugal and revisionist conception of marriage, it's difficult to see how the Constitution can be said to have dictated a choice one way or another, for the simple reason that there simply isn't a view of marriage in the Constitution. I mean, the founders took for granted what everybody took for granted about what marriage was. They didn't think they had to constitutionalize an understanding of marriage. But by not constitutionalizing an understanding of marriage, they left the matter where anything that's not constitutionalized under our constitutional system is left. That is, to the people and their elected representatives. So what Obergefell represents really is a usurpation of your authority and mine as a democratically constituted people. The authority we enjoy under the Constitution, acting either on our own through initiative or referenda where those are permitted, or via our elected representatives to impose on us something that we did not choose. Some of us may have favored it, others favored the other point of view. But what the court did was take away that constitutional authority and resolve the question by their own lights. But lay all that aside for now. I introduced the case because it forces us to focus on the logical implications of abolishing the conjugal understanding of marriage in our law and replacing it with the revisionist understanding of marriage as sexual romantic companionship, and all by judicial fiat. Here is where Professor Dworkin's point about the centrality of principle to law has its significance for the cause of polyamory, at least for his fellow liberals who approve of the role assumed by the judiciary in cases such as Roe and Obergefell. He who says A must say B, where the same principle requires B. And he who says that the judiciary has the power to dictate A must say that the judiciary has the power to dictate B, even if B doesn't yet share A's popularity, and even if the people's representatives in the legislatures say no to B. The constitutional case for the judicial imposition of same-sex marriage requires the belief that the Constitution, somewhere, somehow, perhaps lurking in penumbras formed by emanations, incorporates the idea of marriage as sexual romantic companionship. You've got to believe that in order to affirm this case. But if it does, then there can be no reason of principle, absolutely none, for withholding legal recognition from the marriages of, say, Yemeni immigrants or breakaway Mormons who are in polygamous relationships, or to polyamorous people like the Youngs. To observe that 75% of the public still opposes legal recognition of multi-partner marriages is only to highlight the need for the courts to intervene, to vindicate the marriage equality rights of those in multiple partner relationships. People who cannot count on their fellow citizens to treat like cases alike when it comes to sexual partnerships, the kind that they happen to disapprove of on moral or religious grounds. By constitutionalizing the issue, by purporting to find a certain vision of marriage in the Constitution, the court eliminated the possibility of accommodations and compromises in the political process. By its own lights, the question is no longer properly left to the moral or policy judgments of the people or the vagaries of constitutional democratic bargaining. As a matter of constitutional principle, rather, it's an all-or-nothing game, a game that only the judges are permitted to play. The American people have been told by the Obergefell majority to watch from the bleachers. If Obergefell stands, and I myself hope that it will not stand, the question of legal recognition of polyamorous partnerships simply will not be able to be avoided. The arguments of those who want to retain the idea of marriage as sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership while denying legal recognition of polyamorous marriages will sound weaker and weaker, more and more like mere rationalizations for stigmatizing what many people, for now at least, still find icky. Under the psychological pressure of the natural human desire for logical consistency, the liberal movement will gradually come to embrace the polyamorist's cause. And liberal jurists, though they may swat away on procedural grounds the first few constitutional challenges to marriage laws, excluding polyamorous romantic bonds from recognition, will eventually have to say B, because Obergefell is the A. And he who says A has to say B, and where A is marriage is sexual romantic companionship, and therefore two persons of the same sex can marry, then B is marriage is sexual romantic companionship, therefore three or more persons can marry. Now, will there be a C? That will likely be the abolition of laws against consensual adult incest, parent-child or sibling, and correspondingly the elimination of consanguinity laws forbidding marriage between a parent and his or her adult child and between adult siblings. Do you think I'm engaging in scare tactics? Do you think that's just this right-winger who's making this stuff up in order to frighten people because, gosh, people think incest, that really is icky? Don't listen to me. Western Europe was ahead a bit of the U.S. on same-sex marriage. It was established in certain Western European countries before it came here. And it's now pointing the way for liberal opinion on incest. Germany's, right? Germany is a classic, you know Germany, right? It's a classic Western democracy. We gave it its constitution. Germany is very much like us, right? Germany's not some weird place. Biggest economy in Europe, largest population, democratic since World War II, freedom, great constitution, as I say, that we gave them and so forth. Well, Germany's National Ethics Council, their equivalent of the President's Council on Bioethics. Richard Williams kindly mentioned that I had served on our country's Council on Bioethics. Well, the equivalent, the German National Ethics Council, in 2015, issued a report, don't take my word for it, we now have the internet, look it up, urging Parliament to revoke legal prohibitions of incest involving consenting adults, arguing that these prohibitions violate, quote, fundamental freedoms, unquote, and, quote, force people into secrecy or to deny their love, unquote. The Ethics Council described opposition to consensual adult incest as a mere social taboo and declared that, quote, neither the fear of negative consequences for the family nor the possibility of the birth of children from such incestuous relationships can justify a criminal prohibition. The fundamental right of adult siblings to sexual self-determination has more weight in such cases than the abstract protection of the family, unquote. The vote was overwhelming. Only a couple of dissenters. If one grants the premises of sexual liberalism, that consenting adults have a right to enter into whatever types of sexual partnerships they like without state interference, and if one embraces the revisionist conception of marriage as committed sexual romantic companionship, then what the German Ethics Council says has to be correct. If you've got those two premises, this conclusion is unassailable. The Council's logic is impeccable. If there's a flaw, it must be in those premises. And yet, it was precisely those premises that were adopted by the liberal movement in our own country. And so, C will indeed come in due course unless A is abandoned. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be happy to take a couple of questions.
I guess the first question that came to mind, best way to phrase this, in regard to a state or a government, in a sense that's enacting legislation on behalf of an entire country, I feel like with the issue with same-gender marriage and same-sex marriage, essentially, because the state is a secular institution, and being an individual who favors a limited involvement of the state in an individual's life, I feel like that the primary obligation of that kind of social construct of maintaining traditional marriage and of safeguarding traditional marriages would rely primarily within religious organizations and churches, because the state they don't have much of a claim for moral authority, I guess you could say. They're supposed to be it's supposed to be an institution that addresses the concerns of the people as a whole, and if the people vote for something, which in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges they did not, but in the case that they do vote for something, that needs to be ratified by the state. So I guess to sum up what I'm saying, and I'm just looking for your thoughts on this, is I find it difficult to reconcile within myself that I want limited government involvement in 90% of issues that I face, but that I want the government to take my morality and more or less legislate it on a national basis, or prevent legislation that's contrary to that on a national basis.
Okay. There are a number of points in there. I probably won't be able to cover all of them, but let me just raise a couple of them. First, you notice that nothing in the argument I gave you for the conjugal conception of marriage appealed to any religious premises or any religious authority, right? You didn't hear any Bible, yeah, right? And the reason for that is not that I'm trying to find a secular language in order to defend religious concepts. It's rather that we can understand the importance and value of marriage precisely as a conjugal relationship by our natural reasoning without the benefit of appeals to revelation. As a matter of fact, I think the religions teach basically the same thing because there's a fundamental, practical, rational, philosophical insight that they've all gotten hold of, and they express in the language of revelation, which would make sense if God, in fact, wills the good for man, and marriage is part of the human good. This can be validated by simply remembering that Christianity or Judaism did not invent the conjugal understanding of marriage and has no unique claim to it. This basic idea of marriage was advanced and defended by classical thinkers who had no contact, so far as anybody is aware, with Hebrew revelation. Socrates as presented by Plato, Plato himself, Aristotle, the Roman Stoic, Musonius Rufus, Xenophanes, Plutarch, all defended the conjugal conception of marriage, both in itself and as essential for the polity to recognize, and that's mainly because of the importance of marriage for the good of children. The state's interest in marriage is not an interest in a sexual relationship just as such. It's an interest in the type of sexual relationship that produces future citizens, that reproduces the society. Now, so first of all, this is not any kind of imposition of religion, and entirely secular people have and can and have defended precisely this view, and they should, because it makes a heck of a lot more sense, even purely on the plane of reason, even leaving revelation out of it, than the domestic partnership, romantic companionship view. Secondly, we can't avoid taking a stand on moral issues having to do with the institutions and principles of our polity. Notice that you yourself are not able to escape it, even in arguing for limited government, because if there were people here, and there may be some, who feel the burn, they've got a very different moral view from yours on the question of limited government. Now, I'm on your side, but there are reasonable people of goodwill who are on the other side. And it's impossible to find a neutral position for government to take between those two moral views. You notice your view about limited government is a moral view. It competes with other views about political morality, including socialist ones, like Senator Sanders, or the Castro brothers, or others who, not to say that his view is just like theirs, but there are various types of socialism, and that view is not a limited government view. So we're going to have a moral view. But even for those of us like you and me, who are going to impose and are willing to impose, if we can get the political power to do it, if we can convince a majority of our fellow citizens, we want to do it by democracy, and we'll live with socialism if the majority of our citizens go for it. We think that's a mistake because we're for limited government. But anyway, we want to try to persuade our fellow citizens to adopt our moral view on the proper scope and role of government. Even for us, we can recognize that there are certain features of civil society that it is necessary for the state to support and reinforce precisely because of the importance of the public interest in those institutions. And one of those is certainly the family. We will not, in the end, be neutral about the family. The government will not be neutral. It's a fantasy to think that the government will be neutral. It's going to adopt one or the other of these two views. It will be either the sexual romantic companionship view, A, B, C, or it will be the conjugal conception. I don't want to impose my view on anybody. I don't want the Supreme Court to read my view into the Constitution. As important as I think my view is, I don't want to commit the sin against democracy that was committed in Obergefell. But I do want to persuade my fellow citizens that children, families, society as a whole would be better off with the conjugal conception than with A that leads to B that leads to C. Not by way of a slippery slope, but by way of logical implication. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, by the way, I've got a book on that. It's actually my first book, which is, and you can get it from the library. It's called Making Men Moral.
Hi, I just have a question. You mentioned how in ancient society there wasn't a sexual orientation and how that's kind of been created in recent years. And who would you say, or what would you attribute to that creation, and why has it been so widely and solidly
Interesting. Yeah,
receptive?
Good. This is right up Richard Williams' alley, so I should actually call him up to answer the question. He would do a much better job than I. I'm not a psychologist, but rather a philosopher. But my impression, my sense is that this is a product of what's sometimes called scientism. It's an effort to remove agency from human behavior, because agency really makes it difficult to give scientific explanations of what happens in the domain of the human. It turns the domain of the human into something like the rest of the physical world. So physics can give an account of billiard balls crossing a plane, right? Billiard balls going along if you use the cue and you strike the what do you call the little white ball, the cue ball, and it hits the 8 ball, and it hits the 8 ball into the 11 ball, and the 11 ball goes into the hole. A physicist could give us an account of exactly why that happened, a truly scientific account, because billiard balls don't have any agency. They do what they have to do.
Yes.
Right? There's no free will. The trouble with trying to give it's a problem for psychology, it's a problem for sociology, it's a problem for political science, and it's a problem for economics. If you try to conceive of those on the model of the natural sciences, the trouble is human beings do have free will. We do have agency. And people want to explain it, want to eliminate it. They want to pretend it's not there so that we can be real scientists when we do psychology and sociology and political science and economics. Mm-hmm. And so you come up with things that will make things work. So sexual orientation, it looks like to me, appeared to the 19th century and early 20th century psychologists as a way of explaining human behavior in a certain domain that would take agency out of the picture and enable us to have a scientific or scientistic, as I would say, account of these things. Now, these were not people necessarily who wanted to promote the sexual revolution. A lot of these people were people who wanted to treat homosexuality as a disease.
Right.
So it doesn't dictate a political agenda one way or another, but I think that's where it came from. I think that's why you don't find things like sexual orientation in the writings of Aristotle or Plato or Maimonides or Aquinas or even Kant or Hobbes or any of the classical thinkers. It's really a construct that people came up with, psychologists came up with much later than that to try to make human beings correspond to scientific categories.
Right. Even in their writings, they talk about bisexuality in a way without giving it any label as far as like Plato and Socrates, but they never talk about any orientation or sexual identity.
No, they certainly are familiar with same-sex relationships, same-sex activity.
Right.
They understand that that cultures help to shape conduct. I mean, which is another point in my book that I recall. I didn't invent it. I actually recalled it from the ancient world and got tenure by doing it. That culture really does shape conduct, which is why in their thought about the polity, their thought about political science or political theory, writers like Plato and Aristotle are very deeply concerned with the morality of the public, with what we would call public morality, because they do realize that the public morality shapes the conduct of individuals. There are expectations and understandings that shape how people will in fact behave. I mean, we can't act from scratch in our society. We don't get to remake by an act of will the expectations and understandings that everybody else will have.
Yes.
And which will affect our lives in profound ways. Thank God you don't have it here at BYU. I'd be shocked if you do. I'm sure you don't. But at my campus at Princeton and at campuses around the country, there's this thing called the hookup culture. Okay, if you don't, you probably know what the hookup culture is. You've got the wonderful Fidelio Society here who tries to bear witness against that kind of thing. Well, look, it's not that kids come to Princeton or Brown or Williams or Stanford just dying to have promiscuous sex and multiple partners and threesomes and all this crazy stuff that goes on in these places. It's they come and there's a certain culture that they find. And that culture brings pressure on them. Now, some kids, if they come from strong ethical backgrounds, will resist it. But it will have meaning even for them. It'll have meanings about things like whether you can even get a date or who's going to be interested in you romantically if you're not playing. Mm-hmm. So no one can just, by an act of will, immunize himself or herself against the expectations and understandings, that framework of expectations and understandings that constitutes a culture. And the quality of that culture, the public morality, is going to make a really big difference for people's own experience of their lives, the ability of parents to raise children, especially in the sexual domain, in a way that will enable the kids as they grow up to have their sexuality playing a positive role in their lives and not a negative role, just the welfare of children generally.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. One more. Yes, sir.
So my question deals with how do you see Obergefell v. Hodges being overturned? Like based on my limited knowledge of court cases and how the Supreme Court works, it's rare that they overturn precedent, and oftentimes when they do, it takes lots of time, lots of years, and change of justices. And so based on what I've seen recently, especially with the recent changes of the Supreme Court, it seems like that would be really difficult to do. And I totally agree with you that I see that the Supreme Court has kind of usurped the democratic vote of the United States people, but they've done what they've done, and it is the law. So how do you see that being overturned or changed?
Okay. A few points in there. First of all, I'm not one of those people who says they've done it and now it's the law of the land. Rather, I side with Abraham Lincoln, who refused to treat the anti-constitutional Dred Scott decision, which was very similar in that it was a usurpation of the authority of the people. I'm not saying slavery and same-sex marriage are the same, or even similar. They're very different issues. But the principle of the court overriding the will of the people with no basis in the text or logic or structure or original understanding of the Constitution is the same. Lincoln, faced with that in his first inaugural address, stated as clearly as anything in all of history that he would not treat that decision as the law of the land. Now, some of the candidates who were at least running for president, including one who's still running for president, has said that he will follow Lincoln's lead, that he will not treat Obergefell as the law of the land. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the Supreme Court of the United States has reversed itself about more than 300 times over history. So it's not at all uncommon. Sometimes it's taken a long time. Between the Plessy versus Ferguson decision near the turn of the century and Brown versus Board of Education was, I think, about 60 years. That was a long time in the lifetime of our relatively young nation. On the other hand, the Supreme Court has sometimes reversed course in less than 3 years. In 1941, the Supreme Court handed down a decision upholding the authority of schools to expel the children of Jehovah's Witnesses, members of the Jehovah's Witnesses faith, because those children refused to salute the flag salutes being banned as the worshiping of graven images by the Jehovah's Witnesses faith. That was a case called Gobitis against Minersville, Pennsylvania. But in 1943, the Supreme Court revisited the issue and overturned Gobitis in a case called West Virginia against Barnett that held that schools could not expel students, that students had the right to remain in school even if they refused to salute the flag. And there have been other cases where you've had quick turnarounds. So sometimes it's taken a long time, sometimes it's been relatively quick. Here, it will all depend on this election, I believe. If a Democrat is elected, then it's a sure thing that this case will not be overturned in my lifetime. And maybe in the lifetime even of our undergraduates who are here. If, on the other hand, one of the two at least one of the three Republicans, maybe two of the three, maybe all three of the three Republicans are elected, it's entirely possible that with the replacement of Justice Scalia by someone who would vote his way, and the replacement of perhaps Justice Ginsburg and Justice Breyer, who are respectively, I think 83 and 78, something like that. So, there's the prospect there of seats coming open. It could be overturned. It was 5-4. It was handed down over really vigorous dissents. I mean, I don't think you can find anywhere in our jurisprudence, including Roe versus Wade and Dred Scott, dissents as defiant as the Obergefell dissent. It does not enjoy widespread, overwhelming support. There's still strong resistance to it, even in some cases among people who personally, as a policy matter, favor same-sex marriage, but they don't think the courts should do this, because if the courts can do it here, they can do it on any other issue. So, in my view, it really does come down to the next election. And since I care about that issue a lot, I really care about what happens in this election.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank all of you.